You're being modest too.
I'm very humble. Thank you very much. Cool. Let's have a word of prayer, do some housekeeping, talk about judges, and then go home. Sound good? Cool. Awesome. Let's have a word of prayer. Let us pray. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. No, seriously. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth, because I will open my mouth in a parable, and I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard, things that we have known, things that our ancestors have told us, and we will not hide them from our children. We will tell them to the coming generation, the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, and the wonders that he has done. Amen. That's a good one. It's not really a prayer. Cool. Housekeeping. So, fourth paper. Is there anyone that has only done the first paper? Only officially? Okay, cool. Then you got to do this one. Last chance. And this is a pretty good one to do. So let's see what we got here. Assignment for short paper 4, Judges 3:12 through 30. Write a paper in which you provide a discussion of the organization, coherence, and purpose of the story of Ehud and Eglon, which is Judges 3:12 through 30. And I think we'll actually read it in class. So don't write a paper about any. I'm not going to tell you the answer, but we'll read it in class. Because there really isn't an answer. There's lots of different ways in which you can, as with all these papers, there's lots of different ways you can do it. Don't write a paper about any specific detail in the story itself. Don't write a personal theological or spiritual reflection on what this story means to you. Oh, when I read this story, I think about my grandmother and about how I don't want to hear it. Right? All I want to hear is for you to provide an overview about how the story is organized and how it holds together. So you read the story, right, and you talk about how it's organized, right? For example, what basic paragraph blocks do you see going on in this story, right? The way I always think about it is, if I imagine a story like a movie, where do the scenes change? So far so good? So, that's the way I think about it often. How do those blocks relate to one another, right? How are they organized? How do they flow from one to the other? And how is the story told? And if you want some help, you can actually look this up in Gorman, chapter 5, for a discussion of formal analysis. The paper itself should consist of any number of paragraphs, not just 5. You probably don't want to do less than 5, but you can certainly do more than 5. The organization and contents of the paragraphs are up to you with the following restrictions. Paragraph 1, blah, 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 same song, the second verse could be better, gonna get worse. The final sentence of the first paragraph should be the paper's main point and should list the separate topics or points that's going to be the main subjects of each of the following middle paragraphs. Same song, right? Same thing we've seen before. Middle paragraphs, yada yada. First sentence of each paragraph introduces one of the topics with the blah 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 blah. Final sentence of each paragraph sums up blah blah blah. Last paragraph, first sentence of the last paragraph reiterates the blah blah blah. Provide by way of conclusion a general discussion of the story and its possible significance, historical and theological, just sort of tie the whole thing up. Don't go into much detail. I don't want to hear about what some detail in the story means or something like that. General. If you choose to provide an actual numbered outline of Judges 3:12 through 30, and you certainly don't have to, but if you want to, make it single spaced and perhaps put it in either the first or second paragraph. Don't make it too long, don't make it too detailed. That not only takes up more space than it's worth, but it also leaves you room to discuss the paragraph. Secondary resources should be used, blah, blah, blah. Biblical citations, blah, blah, blah. Double space, 12.5, Times New Roman, I don't have that in there, but it should be Times New Roman all around, 1 inch margins all around, cover sheet, blah, blah, blah. No more than 4 pages, not 3 pages, but 4 pages. Get an extra page to work with if you want it. Any questions, concerns? And again, you can still get Gorman about formal analysis is what this paper is about. Sound good? Questions, concerns? Comments? Yes, prairie dogs, donations. It says it's been 2 weeks, so for this one, you actually have 2 weeks to do it. Cool, awesome, splendid, you did it. Well, let's see what we got with judges. Did everybody like buy this book and read it? The Book of Judges by Roy L. Heller? No? Okay, then we'll have to lecture, because all the lecture today is I'm just going to say what I'm doing here. As a way of introduction, I think I'm going to introduce it. I've never introduced this lecture this way, but I think I'm going to, before I introduce the outline, I want to talk a little bit about tragedy. Tragedy not as in bad things that happen, but tragedy as in the literary form of tragedy. You know about Romeo and Juliet, right? Like the play, not the people. Right? Julius Caesar, right, is a tragedy. Here's one that's not Shakespearean. Oedipus Rex is a tragedy. On a more contemporary front, Death of a Salesman is a tragedy. As far as movies go, I don't know if you've ever seen it. When I teach the Book of Judges as an exegesis class, English exegesis class, we usually spend the second class watching the movie High Noon, because it's exactly, 80 minutes long. It's exactly the same length as a class period. And High Noon, if you've never seen High Noon, oh my God, it's a classic. It's wonderful. Gary Cooper, it's really, really good. It's a Western, but it sort of turns the Western on its head. And in my opinion, it's a tragedy. What is a tragedy? That is, this type of literary form. Well, in this book at least. Actually, I'm not going to read what I wrote. I'm going to read something else. The idea of tragedy goes all the way back to Aristotle. And this is what Aristotle had to say about tragedy. This is from the Poetics. So a tragedy then, Aristotle says, is the imitation of an action that is serious and also, as having magnitude, it's complete in itself, right? You can sort of read the beginning, middle, and end, or you can see the beginning and middle of the end of a play or something like that, right? So it's complete in itself, it's something serious. In language, with pleasurable accessories, right? It's not difficult to pay attention to. Each kind brought in separately in the parts of the work, in a dramatic, not a narrative form, right? According to Aristotle, this has to do with plays, right? It's not something that you read, which is going to be a difference here, obviously, with the Book of Judges. But in a dramatic, not a narrative form, with incidents, and this is the important part for me at least. This is the thing that marks tragedy from comedy or other types of things. With incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis, that is a cleaning out of such emotions. For Aristotle, what a tragedy is, and the reason why we, it's so funny because the day before yesterday, I went right over to Meadows and saw A Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams. Brilliant tragedy, it really is. And I was talking to my wife beforehand about going to see it, and we were talking about it back and forth. And I said, it's a funny thing because I know going into this that it's not going to end well. I mean, Blanche is going to go crazy, and Stella and Stanley are going to like stay together even though he beats her. And again, it's not going to end up well. And yet, there's something about going to see that play or any tragedy that actually does you good. It's not fun. You don't leave laughing, trust me. But there's something that does you good. And according to Aristotle, the thing that does you good with seeing a tragedy is that it arises within you, or it arouses within you, two things. It arouses within you pity, and that is you see these characters. You see these characters on stage. You see Stanley, you see Stella, you see Blanche, you see Midge. You see these characters on stage, and you empathize with them. There's Romeo and Juliet, Oedipus even himself, right? You see those characters and somehow you identify with them and you feel sorry for them. It arouses pity, compassion within you, but it also arouses fear. And the fear that it arouses is because you identify with them, you don't in your own life want to fall into the same trap that these characters have fallen into, and therefore destroy your own life like theirs are being destroyed. Right? You're not, it sort of warns you with Romeo and Juliet. And again, tragedy works in a much more delicate and nuanced way than what I'm going to be talking about right now. But when I see Romeo and Juliet, what it really does is that it warns me about impetuousness. Right? I mean, he sees her at a ball, right? And suddenly it's like, this is the only woman in the world, right? Which is kind of sweet, but like within 36 hours, everyone's going to be dead, right? Because he like falls head over heels in love with, quote unquote, in love with this girl, right? It warns me about going down the same path. It warns me about those parts of human nature that in themselves are rather innocuous. Within themselves, they're actually parts of human nature. Within themselves, they're kind of parts of everything in people. Everybody has these types of aspects of their personalities. And yet, through watching a tragedy, it becomes a cautionary tale. And you start seeing how these innocuous little aspects of our personality, if we give them sway, if we give into them in an inordinate amount, they will kill us. And within 36 hours, everyone's going to be dead. All of that, I say, is that it seems to me that the Book of Judges is best understood as a tragedy. It's the best, for me at least, I think it's the best way to sort of understand it. People will read the Book of Judges, I think, and one of the things that people will say about it is, oh my God, it's so violent. Well, yeah, right? In fact, I don't know a tragedy that isn't in some aspects violent. For me at least, as opposed to Joshua, which we talked about last time, perhaps you remember, the problem with Joshua, I think, is that it's also a very violent book. And yet it sees the violence as a really wonderful thing. The Book of Judges, in my opinion, is very violent. And yet over and over and over, as the violence increases, just like most tragedies, as the violence increases, it evokes in us pity and fear about that violence. There is, in my opinion, probably no other book in the whole Bible that argues so strongly against violence, warns us about the influences of violence upon our psyches in the Book of Judges. Yes, it's a very violent book. But I think because it's very violent, that's what it's kind of the point. So there's my sort of introduction to what I think this book is about. Cool, let's sort of take a look at the outline of it. I'm just going to talk about this. I wrote a book about it, so I sort of know this. The thing about the Book of Judges is that there are two introductions on the front of the book. And the second introduction is actually the first. And the first introduction is actually the second one. And we'll talk about that in a second. Throughout, for the middle part of it, there are a series of what's called the judge cycle. And you know what a cycle is. You sort of go around and you wind up in the same spot, right? It's kind of like watching, I don't know, ER or Law and Order, right? Or Friends, or, right? The show always starts in basically the same spot. Something happens, some complication happens, and then a climax and a resolution, and you wind up at the end of the show, basically in the same spot you were at the beginning. That's a cycle. And that's what's going to happen with these judge cycles in the middle There's going to be Othniel, there's going to be Ehud, there's going to be Deborah, Barak, Jael, there's going to be Gideon. After Gideon, there's going to be a funny little story about a guy called Abimelech, who's not a judge. It's just sort of stuck right in the middle in chapter 9. After Abimelech, there's going to be Jephthah. After Jephthah, there's going to be Samson. And after Samson, there's going to be two conclusions. And the first was going to be the first, and the second was going to be the second. So that's how the book is laid out. And in here, right, cycles. So far, so good? I would have drawn that on there, but I drew it on the board. Let's talk about the introductions. When I say that the second one is the first and the first one is the second, well, I'll go ahead and show you this. Again, nobody's trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Nobody's trying to make things complicated for you. Just notice this. In Judges 1:1, you just have to pay attention. It's not like really complicated, but you do have to pay attention. In 1:1, notice this. The first 5 words. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord. Right? So we just got done with Joshua. At the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua dies, which is an appropriate place for him to die. In the book of Joshua. Right? And so Judges picks up right there. After the death of Joshua. So far, so good? Cool. At the beginning of the second introduction, in chapter 2, verse 6, when Joshua dismissed the people, notice he was dead in 1:1, and suddenly he's alive again in 2:6. You see that? Because in fact, the original ending of the book, the original beginning of the book was in 2:6. Right? So at the end of Joshua, we have him gathering all the people, blah, blah, blah. He gathers all the people, he blesses them, and he dies. And so what the first introduction, which is actually the second, the first introduction does is just sort of pick up just a little bit before that and review what goes on at the end of the book of Joshua, and then picks up the story. So far, so good? But what happened was that then there was another introduction that was put on the front after that actually picks up exactly at the end of the book of Joshua and picks it up. So far, so good? Cool. There are actually 2 different types of introductions. When you take a look at the second introduction, which is the first, that is the 1:1 through 2:5, when you take a look at this one, the way in which it's organized, and again, we'll read it in just a second, but I'll go and tell you, the way in which it's organized is that we have sort of a little a battle notice, a little war notice, with a little, and then a little vignette, a little story is thrown in. Then we have another battle notice, then we have a little vignette, a little story. And then we have another battle notice, and we have a little vignette. And I think there are 3 or 4 little vignettes in this first introduction. Consistently, what happens throughout the war stories and the little vignettes is this, is that we start off in a really great place. And by the end, we wind up in chaos. Second introduction, which is the first. In the first introduction, which we'll look at in just a second, what happens is that we start off in a really great place. And by the end of it, we wind up in chaos. In this one, however, what we do is that it's not a straight line going down. In the first introduction, which is the second, what happens is that there's a cycle. A cycle that's mentioned in the first introduction, which is the second. And that's how we get there, to this cycle. For me at least, you can't get past the first 2, you can't get past the introductions without knowing that this is going to be a tragedy. In good Deuteronomic style, it beats you over the head. We're going to start off in a great place, and we're going to wind up in chaos. We're going to start off in a great place, we're going to wind up in chaos. We're going to just descend there, slowly, slowly, slowly. We're going to get there by means of a cycle. What these 2 introductions do, obviously, is